for the rest of our day in terms of building how can we take those fragments and be able to put them, the tough bits, in compactile areas at the bottom to make sure that the nice comfy clothes are on the top. Is there any better way in terms of what we're trying to do and here to do by way of a metaphor? So thank you very, very much. And what I'd like to do now is introduce our next speaker. Our next speaker is Ailsa Carmichael QC, and she is another colleague, friend, supported, trusted other of the Scottish Centre for Conflict Resolution, and she was of particular help through the Faculty of Advocates, and our relationship with them is just getting real momentum and growing. But we were very pleased to have the Human Rights seminar just on the 9th of December of last year. I understand that was the day before Human Rights Day. There's a report that can be made available to you in making reference to that. But it's really, this is about making the relationships connect with all the different parts of society that is in Scotland. And so I'd really like to introduce Ailsa to you and ask her to really share with us why she has got involved with the Scottish Centre for Conflict Resolution and the great work that she's doing around family conflict and finding creative solutions. Ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for Ailsa Carmichael. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can everyone hear? Microphone working? Good. Before I start talking about criminal justice, I'd like to share with you first something that happened in a family home not very far from here, not very long ago, and as I realise now, a situation that might well have benefited from the expertise of the previous speaker from whom you just heard. A feverish 4-year-old has decided that she doesn't want her Calpol. Her parents know that it will probably make her feel better if she takes it. They wouldn't want to try to force her to take it. But actually, even if they did, it wouldn't work. She would spit it out. She says decidedly that she will take it when she's ready. Only ready isn't happening anytime soon. The dispute seems intractable. One of the parents, as it happens, is trained in mediation by CEDAR. The skills acquired in that training, unfortunately, don't seem to be making a lot of difference on this occasion. There are big and difficult emotions generated by what is a very common, everyday sort of parenting difficulty. A child wants to exert control. Perhaps she just wants her own agency. She's found a context where she can do that. She's unwell, she's tired, and she's very, very young. Her judgment isn't great about the situation. There are big emotions in the parents as well. They're worried about the child. They're worried why she seems to want so much control of the situation. They feel very strongly that they know what would be better. They're frustrated by their utter inability in that moment to deliver to the child what they know the child needs to feel a bit better. They're asking themselves, why can I not make this better? Why can I not solve this problem? She's only 4, for goodness sake. As you probably guess, the events are very close to home for me. They happened in my own home at a time when I was thinking about just what I wanted to say to you today. And I have to admit that they left me asking myself, on what basis do I come and speak to anybody about anything at all to do with family conflict, let alone resolving it in any context? And just for the record, it's my husband who's the trained mediator. So why am I telling you this story? Well, first, because it's a very trivial, banal even, example of how quite big, difficult, painful emotions are generated by even a minor conflict of this sort in a family situation. It's the one that happens long before the child has become a teenager, with teenage hormones and when, as recent research tells us, brains start to rewire themselves for a period. And again, you've heard already about this morning about the brain chemistry of adolescents and just how that can impact on the way they manage or fail to manage situations of stress and conflict. That drug cabinet, that difficult drug cabinet in their minds. And it happens long before the children are as big or bigger than the parents or other carers. Second, I mention the fact that one of the parents is a trained mediator, not to devalue mediation, but quite the opposite. Sometimes even someone with considerable skills and training in conflict resolution is just too close to the problem. And that's exactly why in mediation we use mediators who are not just skilled and trained people, but they're people who are not themselves too close to the problem and too close to the difficult emotions. The third point of the story is that the tone of my address is of seeking to emphasise why we so urgently need innovative thinking around the resolution of family conflicts and seeking to stimulate discussion as to how we do that, rather than presuming to propose what all of the solutions should be. And for that, I'm turning to you for your collective expertise and experience. Now, I'd like you to try to hold all of these three thoughts in your mind as I turn to what is the main theme of my address today, which is family conflict and criminal justice. Now, just a preface, what I'm not saying, and I should be quite clear about this, is that criminal justice doesn't need to intervene in situations where there's family conflict. Sometimes, plainly, it does. It must provide protection to victims, and it must punish and rehabilitate offenders. Please take those things as a given in everything that I say from here on in. What I am saying, however, is that when criminal justice has to get involved, it has very significant and sometimes potentially damaging consequences itself. Family relationships are certainly not always improved by the process. Criminal justice solutions also have limitations in addressing the root of the problems that derive from conflicts within the family. And that is why, precisely why, what the Scottish Centre for Conflict Resolution promotes, which is early intervention to prevent situations from escalating to crisis point, is so very, very important. Anything that we as a society can do to help families avoid the sort of crises that give rise to the involvement of criminal justice in their lives is a good thing, a necessary thing, something that we must embrace. Now, all over Scotland today, in every sheriff courthouse in the country, stories of the sort that I'm about to describe are being told. The stories may be emerging in the course of trials, or they may be being told in the context of somebody pleading guilty, the prosecutor explaining what happened, and a defence lawyer providing a plea in mitigation explaining why the accused person says it happened. And the circumstances that I'm describing don't come from any one real-life case, but are adapted from a variety of different real-life situations. Let's take the first one. A teenager and his mother become involved in a dispute about using the family television to play on the PlayStation for a long time. Again, something that could happen in any home. However, on this occasion, there is a crisis. He uses abusive language towards her. She loses her temper, shouts and swears at him, and strikes him. She's done something that no adult should ever do to a child. He calls his great aunt. He's stayed with her in the past from time to time when things have been difficult at home. This has always happened informally. This is not a family who've been on the radar of social services at all. The great aunt and the great uncle come along to the house. There's then a further argument between mum and great aunt and uncle. It spills out onto the street. The mother shouts and swears at them and accuses them of interfering. She threatens them. A neighbour calls the police, and the mother is taken into custody. Another example, a 14-year-old and his stepfather have a difficult ongoing relationship. But again, there's never been involvement either of social services or criminal justice in the family before. The tensions erupt on a particular evening because the stepfather believes that the 14-year-old has taught a younger child in the family to swear. The stepfather and the boy have a heated argument and shout and swear at each other. The stepfather pushes the boy away. Later in court, there will be an explanation: he was getting in my face. Neighbours are so concerned by the noise that they call the police. The stepfather is taken into custody. Well, what happens then? In the first case, the mother is charged with assaulting her son, and she's also charged under Section 38 of the Criminal Justice and Licensing Scotland Act with what's effectively a breach of the peace. When she appears in court, there may be bail conditions that are imposed that prevent her from seeing her son. Either she or he may have to move out of the family home for a period. He may have to give evidence against her in court if the charge is disputed. His younger sister, who witnessed her brother being struck, will also have to give evidence, and so will great aunt and great uncle. In the second case, the stepfather appears in court. He's charged with assault by pushing the boy, and he's also charged with a breach of the peace. He is excluded from the family home by reason of the bail conditions imposed. Pleas of not guilty are recorded. Trial diets and intermediate diets are fixed in both cases, and there will be further appearances in court. It will take time before the cases are disposed of, even though these will be treated as priority cases that ought to be heard as quickly as possible because there are child witnesses involved. Now let's just fast forward a couple of weeks in the second case, the one with the stepfather and the 14-year-old boy. An application comes to the court for a variation of the bail conditions of the accused. You remember that he's been excluded by a special bail condition from the family home. It's accompanied by a letter from the accused's wife, the mother of the complainer. It says that she's not able to go to work because she relies on the accused to look after the younger children when she's on the night shift. She's currently signed off sick, but if the situation persists, she'll lose her job. She writes also that a lot of the family budget is going on the rental of the property that the accused has had to move into. She says she's desperate to have him back in the family home. A sheriff somewhere has to decide what to do. Now again, let's be clear. I'm not criticising the decisions that have been made in relation to the bail conditions in these cases. Sheriffs have to decide every day on a case-by-case basis whether particular conditions are necessary, whether that's to prevent further offences being committed, or whether to protect vulnerable witnesses, potentially vulnerable witnesses, from being persuaded not to give evidence. But what I am pointing out is just the cascade of consequences for the family and society that can ensue if matters become so bad that offences are committed in a context of family conflict. Criminal justice tools are sometimes like blunt instruments rather than scalpels in situations where they come to operate on the family, which is a delicate organism with very many interdependent parts and interconnected organs. In that example, the state can remove a person from the family home, and it may be absolutely right and absolutely necessary that it does so. But it can't solve the other problems from the family that may ensue from that person's removal. Let's fast forward again, this time in the first case, to the sentencing exercise. The sheriff finds out that the mother has an earlier conviction for assault, not of a domestic nature, not an offence against a child. The Sheriff has also learned in the course of the proceedings that there's a history of conflict between the mum and the great-aunt who had in fact been her principal carer as a child. The Sheriff gets a criminal justice social work report, and what it recommends is a period of supervision, with one of the areas for focused work and supervision being helping the mother to rebuild family relationships. The Sheriff follows that recommendation. Now, that's obviously, or it seems obviously to me, to be a disposal that has the potential to change things for the better. But how much better if before these offences had been committed, there had been the possibility of the people involved learning to avoid conflict escalating in the way that it obviously has done in these cases. In that first case, we may be looking at 3 generations of family conflict and family difficulty. Perhaps the mother did not learn from her carers the skills that she needs to help in resolving conflicts with her children. Perhaps a pattern is being repeated which has the potential to cause difficulty in a further generation again. That level of inquiry is not something I think that the criminal justice system is particularly well equipped to engage in. There may be a cycle crying out to be broken. So where does that take us? Well, I hope I've emphasised in what I've just said, the stories that I've just told, some of the reasons why I think it's so important that Scottish society takes every opportunity to investigate and embrace means of dispute resolution in the family, which can help families avoid crises of the sorts that I've mentioned here. I firmly believe in the potential for mediation to assist in the resolution of conflict in families. I believe that people can be taught skills to help them de-escalate conflicts in their lives, even where their own life experiences to date have not equipped them with those skills. There are a number of therapies that are used in mental health contexts, and I understand starting to be used in prison contexts, such as mentalisation therapy, which can give people skills to start to understand where other people are coming from if that's not something that they've already been able to access through their own life experiences. But what I want to discuss, and what I'd like the discussion that follows this paper, and I think there is time for, 10 minutes allowed for discussion. What I'd like the discussion to look at, and again, I'm turning to you as the experts in practicing mediation, teaching conflict resolution skills, and delivering services to people who need them. How do we reach families where a crisis might be brewing? How do we reach families who aren't already in contact with services that might direct them to mediation? In my experience, while there will certainly families that come into the criminal justice court, there are many who are already on the radar of social services, but very many are not, and criminal justice is actually the first, the involvement with criminal justice is the first trigger to anybody else becoming involved with the family. How do we make ordinary families who might be at a point of a crisis of the type that I've described to you today aware of the sorts of services that SCCR can direct them to? And I ask you also to think about something even more radical and include it in your thoughts and discussions. And again, I'm not here with proposals and solutions, but genuinely seeking to stimulate discussion among people who know more about this than I do. I only see it from the lawyer side. Some of you may be aware of a well-publicised and very considered and thoughtful address given recently by Sheriff Principal Pyle, not in the context of an intergenerational conflict, but in the rather different, but perhaps in some ways not unrelated, context of intimate relationship violence perpetrated by men against women. I ask you to consider something that he suggested in that context, whether there is any scope for identifying cases involving conflict between parent and child where a crisis has actually already occurred, a criminal justice type crisis, which might be suitable for diversion not away from the police and the prosecution service, but from the courts. And second, in that context, for providing support to address the underlying problems in the relationships in a family in a way that sentencing solutions can't always do following conviction or plea of guilty. Now, there are considerable challenges in that approach. How do we distinguish cases where there is a real risk of serious, serial, ongoing abuse from cases where intergenerational conflict has erupted into a single episode of criminal behaviour? Again, I suspect there is a great deal of expertise in the room. Another challenge is the provision of support in that context, directing people to the appropriate support, providing it in a formal way if there were to be diversions from prosecution. And I say, these are challenges which I ask you as people who know and care about conflict resolution and the consequences of conflict in the family to discuss and to ponder. As I said earlier, I personally believe firmly in the power of mediation and alternative dispute resolution to effect change for the better. As a lawyer, I'm excited by any potential to use this in ways that help society where the courts may struggle to do so to best effect in all cases. Now, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Ailsa. I think there's a huge amount to reflect on. There's 4 thoughts there, is there not? But is there anything from the floor that you may be able to share? I think this is a bit of an open door in terms of the legal profession asking for your help. And might there be an opportunity here to share either a reflection, an experience, or even a suggestion in terms of how we move forward to make sure that the legal profession is able to make an informed choice decision going forward and appropriately?
Of those examples that you identified, they may not have been on the radar of social services, but they certainly would have been after those police incidents. And although a social worker myself, I'm very critical of the thresholds, etc., and I think sometimes it can be disproportionate. In those kind of examples, the intervention that could then follow could, in some ways, depend on the outcomes of the care plan that would be identified from that specific incident, because that would go down the child protection route, and they would be looking at, some form of working with this family in order to have some kind of resolution, and that in itself might, instead of being a negative outcome, actually inform a kind of legal system.
So if I'm hearing you, is that getting around the table earlier to see what's available?
Well, yeah, I mean, at the point of the police intervention would automatically trigger the child protection outcome, referral system. So at that point, where you're looking at proportionality, then you might be able to look at some kind of intervention that may, appease the court and inform a different outcome.
So as opposed to having a hierarchical piece where the legal takes is the top level, it would be taking a more distributive approach.
Some of that.
And how we look at that.
Now, of course, I take that on board, and in some real life cases, what will have happened by the time of sentencing is that something like that will happen, and the defence lawyer will come along and say, well, actually, you don't need to do anything here. You may just be able to defer sentence to see how the person gets on with their interaction with social services. That is not always, it's not always my experience that happens, but it certainly has been in some cases that there has been a positive intervention after criminal justice has become involved, and that the limited, the court's actions have thereafter been relatively limited because something is being addressed by that means.
Thank you. Any other comments? Saj?
I was going to ask a question, but to flip it onto the other side, where it's the child, where it's the child that's doing the things that are upsetting the family fold. At what point is the right point to bring the legal justice system in if you feel that there's no social work support there for that child? You know, at what point do you say, okay, this is the route to take, or what is it? What's the way that you deal with the children because they're minors?
Well, these ultimately are decisions taken by prosecutors and the reporters service, because some offending by children will be addressed through the children's hearing system, as I'm sure you're all aware, and some, once it gets to, if it's a particular level of seriousness, it may not be, and children are put in the adult courts, which brings with it, of course, a whole host of other challenges for the justice system in terms of providing facilities and trials that are fair and understandable to children. I certainly, in terms of when they become involved, ultimately, I suppose I imagine a situation where a parent at the end of their tether phones the police and says, take him away, he's beating me up, I cannot take any more of this, I've tried to get him to school, the conflict here is just appalling. Now, again, that is going to, assuming that there's not been any radar before that, but then again, I suppose my example, the boy's not going to school, there probably is a bit of a radar there in some way, but that's probably going to kick off an intervention of the sort that you're talking about. I suppose what I'm challenging, or trying to challenge the room to do in what I see is, how do we get to families before it gets there?
Yes. Yeah.
How do we do that? Because that is the huge value of early intervention, is that it is early, but how do we find people before it's, I don't want to say too late, because it's never too late, and there are always going to be, hopefully, interventions that will help in some way, but how do we do it before it's later?
Understood. No, very clear. Anyone on the floor? Graham?
Is part of the challenge the same challenge that comes to people wanting to go to mediation itself, in understanding that they're actually in trouble and that the things that they're dealing with are things that that there is assistance with, and there are things that they can be supported with, without them in themselves then thinking that they have somehow failed, because I think that's one of the challenges that people have is, I'm going to go and talk to somebody who I've never spoken to before about this, and in some way does that mean that I failed and that I'm going to be on trial because of that? And so it's getting the nuance of that pitch and then getting that within the right networks so that people can become aware that that sort of support exists.
Unfortunately, there's massive queues. I'm on a waiting list that's a year long just for the school counsellor, and I've been on the CAMS waiting list since August last year, and I'm not looking to get an appointment anytime before June. So that's a whole year of dealing with this constant behaviour without a solution, which just makes everything worse. And it just leads to the point where you're at that point where you're going, okay, so is this placement going to break down? But I hear the support's there, but it's not there when you need it. Because a year later, it's a totally different situation and nothing's been resolved. So I think that's a really big problem, that, everybody is saying, yeah, the support's there, but it's not there when you need it. We have to wait a year before anybody gets seen, and then it's assessment after assessment. So nothing's really resolved till about a year and a half later. I'm still in the waiting process from last summer. So
Sarge, thank you. You've given us a very clear synopsis of what it's like for you, and I think where we were in terms of feeling listened and valued, having the right support, and having a sense of hope. That's possibly where we've got to go and be in terms of the title around being more creative. I think all of you nodded, did you not, when we need to get support in earlier? Now, clearly, that's a shared challenge. I feel, just in terms of the purposes of time, I hope you don't mind me surmising, to really think that this is an issue that we're not going to be able to address and answer completely today. But I do hope that you feel, with that sense of people feeling listened to and valued earlier, people feeling the support and being aware of that support. We're on a journey as a society, are we not, pulling that together? But ultimately, where is that sense of hope? So we really need to continue this dialogue, do we not, to be wider and be taking something forward, so you can go back to your profession and how we can, in collaboration, which is really what the partnership is looking for, take that forward.
To say something, and so am I. I think what you're saying, Ailsa, is intrinsically important to the work that we hope to take forward with this, the Scottish Mediation Network. We've got Relationships Scotland in the room, we've got the Spark, and we've got mediation services from across Scotland. So from my perspective, I think there is a huge opportunity for us to work collaboratively and collectively together. And I've got my own Mike Rogers over there, sitting quietly, who I met many, many years ago, and was back down speaking to East Lothian just yesterday. And in terms of reducing homelessness, we saw it originally at the point of crisis, and we've rolled it back to the point of prevention, and we're now entering a new opportunity of working in an early intervention model. We're in a really fantastic position, both as a centre and everybody that's got that willingness to work alongside us as mediators and people that have got expertise in conflict resolution. And I think if we think about this really strategically, about how do we join up and how do we use the very limited resources but huge expert experience to begin to bring about some significant change. And I think the reason we're all in the room here today is because we actually do care about seeing that transition take place. So my hopes is that if there's more of us actually joined together to work collaboratively and look across health, education, housing, homelessness and the voluntary sector, I really truly believe that we can do it. But it takes a lot of energy and it takes a lot of commitment, and it does take a lot of strategising and joined up thinking. But I don't think it's out with our gift. I really don't. And I think getting it to families that are behind closed doors, and that's me and it's you and it's everybody out there, I think it is particularly doable. But it just takes a lot of dedication and a lot of conviction and a lot of people that's prepared to go that extra mile and break down some of the boundaries and barriers around the sort of professionalisms as well. And I would like to be part of that process going forward.
Yeah, I just was, I'm a counsellor in Edinburgh, and when I grew up, I didn't know what counselling was, and I'm very excited now that schools are making sure that they have at least a counsellor that they can bring in for children. So there's something about talking, and we are talking just now, and taking away a stigma of wanting help and needing help. So that actually, if it's spoken about earlier, if people realise it's quite okay to have conflict and go and seek help before it gets to a crisis point. So there is something like the gentleman there was saying, was about getting it known, getting it becoming every day, getting it so that families all over can feel comfortable in accessing help, that it's okay to do that. And so that's where I feel there's a lot of hope in the room today.
Thank you, Alison. We're just about to move on to our workshops, but before I do, I'd like to ask you all please to give Ailsa a huge thank you. And before you do that, Ailsa, I hope you are leaving today knowing that there are people in this room that are keen to continue that dialogue, and that there's a great deal of hope here in that we don't have the answers yet, but I do think by working with yourself and continuing the relationship we have with the Faculty of Advocates, I hope that all of us can leave to go and commit to having a conversation outside of this room to make sure that we can actually give permission for people not to feel that stigma that's been come out, that difficulty around talking about when we have conflict in our lives. So for your part in making that happen, thank you very much, and for being here today. Very grateful. Thank you very much.